Greetings folks and welcome to another 8/16/32-bit. I'm your host Rob, and today we're looking at a battle that's been 40 years in the fighting. Yes, it's the battle between those 16-bit home computer behemoths, the Atari St and the Commodore Amiga. Now, as I say, this battle's been raging for just a touch over 40 years at the time of recording, and it's a battle that has strong adherence on both sides of the divide. But which machine really was the better machine? Was it Atari's first out of the blocks 16-bit home computer, or was it Commodore's more initially business focused 16-bit computer? Well, today we're going to take a look and find out. So without further ado, let's just quickly go over the specifications of each machine so we can get a feel for what we're dealing with here. So initially we have the Atari St. Now there's a lot of stories behind the launch of the Atari St and how it came into being in the Amiga, which I'm not going to get into here because undoubtedly that will annoy fanboys from one side or the other who will both tell me that whichever way I tell the story is the wrong way. So we're going to skip that and we're just going to look at the specs. Now, the Atari St was a 16-bit home computer. Now, it was based around a Motorola 68000 CPU clocked at 8 MHz. It initially came with either 512K or 1 MB of RAM. It had a Yamaha YM2149 PSG/FM synthesis sound chip, which was capable of 3 square wave channels on 1 white noise channel in mono. It had a 360K 3.5 inch floppy disk drive, and its graphics chip was capable of driving a display anywhere from 320 by 200 resolution at 16 colours up to 640 by 400 resolution in monochrome. Now, the 16 colours that could be displayed on screen came from a power of 512. Now, the hardware itself featured a number of custom chips. There was the shifter, which was for video shift registers, the GLU, which was a general logic unit, which helped manage the system, the MMU, which was a memory management unit chip, and the DMA, which allowed direct memory access for things such as the floppy disk drive. Now, there were a number of support chips on board for MIDI control, interrupt control, floppy drive control, keyboard, mouse and joystick control. Now, in terms of the ports on the system to get all of this power out to the user, you had a TV out port on the FM/M models, which came out a couple of months after release. There was the famous MIDI port on the Atari St, which is why the ST ended up in so many music studios, an RS-232 serial port, a Centronics standard printer port, a 13-pin DIN monitor port, which allowed for RGB or composite video out, a 14-pin DIN extension port, which allowed for the connecting of a secondary floppy disk drive, a DMA port, which allowed external devices such as a hard drive to be attached, and 2 Atari standard 9-pin joystick ports, which were used to plug in a joystick and a mouse. Now, the Atari St was an all-in-one system like many of the 8-bits, so the keyboard and the initial floppy drive were included in the unit, and the form factor was affectionately known as a wedge. The St did have its very distinct diagonal function keys, and when this machine launched in July of 1985, it was available for $799 with a monochrome monitor, or $999 with a color monitor, which at the time represented pretty good value for money. Now, the Amiga. In the same month that the Atari St officially launched, Commodore officially launched the first model of the Amiga 1000, and its specifications run as follows. Like the Atari St, The CPU was a Motorola 68000, albeit slightly slower clocked at 7.14 MHz. As a machine, it came with anywhere from 256k of RAM all the way up to 10 megabytes, but 512 was about the standard. The sound was generated by one of the many custom chips within the Amiga hardware, the Paula, and that was a 4-channel PCM chip, which helped give the Amiga its unique sound, and this was also a stereo output. The 3.5-inch floppy drive included with the Amiga was an 880k version, so, you know, not bad. In terms of its graphical prowess, it could display from 320 by 256 up to 320 by 512i in 32 colours, up to 4096 in what was known as hold and modify mode. That was really just used for still images. The resolution could go all the way up to 640 by 256 or 640 by 512i in 16 colours. Now, in terms of the custom chips inside, the original Amiga used what was called the OCS, or the original chipset. Now, it had the aforementioned Paula chip, which, as well as handling the audio, also controlled all the input-output, so keyboard, mouse, etc., ran through that. Then there was the Angus, which was a control chip, which had the Blitter and the Copper chips in it, which helped with video effects and fast access to memory. And you also had Denise, which was another video chip, which helped give the Amiga its distinctive graphical look. Now, in terms of ports, you had an analog RGB out, a TV out, a composite out, 2 RCA jacks for audio out, a keyboard port, because this was not an all-in-one like the ST, this was much more like a PC with it having a separate case and keyboard. It had 2 9-pin Atari standard ports for mouse and joystick inputs, an RS-232, a Centronics printer port, a floppy disk port, and a custom 86-pin expansion port. Now, the Amiga 1000 launched officially the same month as the Atari St, July 1985, but it was substantially more expensive, coming in at $1,285 on launch. Now, a couple of years later, this was condensed down into the much more familiar A500 model, which was in essence the exact same hardware specs, albeit at a significantly lower launch price of $699. So when people think of the Amiga, that's what they think of, but for the first couple of years of its life, the A500 wasn't in existence. Now, both systems were early adopters of graphical user interfaces. Now, the Atari St used its core operating system of TOS with the GEM desktop over the top of it, which gave birth to the much loved Little Green desktop, whereas the Amiga used Kickstart and then the Workbench ROM, which again had its own unique look and was one of the first multitasking operating systems on the market. Now, when we look through the core hardware specs here, it's the custom chips that make the difference. The core hardware, the CPU, the RAM, they're essentially identical. You know, the Atari St, in fact, has a slight edge with the CPU being clocked slightly faster. And initially, this did play out in the market. I mean, given that the ST was cheaper and a smaller form factor, for that first couple of years up to the A500 coming out, the Atari ST was the more prominent machine, and in terms of what we look at on this channel, games, that meant that the Atari ST was the lead platform. So often games were converted from the ST to the Amiga, which, you know, when you look at games from that sort of 85 to 87 period, the ST games tend to perform a bit better because when they're converted over to the Amiga, almost none of them took advantage of that extra custom hardware that Commodore had packed in there with the Blitter chip and the Denise chip. that was just not taken into account a lot of the time. So when it was running on just that base hardware, the ST often took a lead, and you know, that's just how these things go. Of course, when you look at the hardware overall, it is very hard to argue, and I have to say this, Atari fanboys, the Amiga hardware was superior. With the custom chips of the OCS, if a game was written to take advantage of the Amiga hardware, it was always going to look better and play smoother on the Amiga than it was on the Atari. That's just a fact, unfortunately. Those extra chips gave it an edge, and ultimately that's why the Amiga became the more popular machine. Once it got the A500 out there in the same form factor as the Atari ST at a similar, albeit slightly higher price point, that was it. The Amiga took the market. Now, does that make it the better machine? From a pure gamer's perspective, probably yes. But there were still times when the ST had an advantage over the Amiga. I mean, you don't hear people talking about keeping an Amiga in their music studios even up to this day, but there are still musicians out there that will use an Atari ST for its MIDI capabilities. The Atari ST is where legendary music software package Cubase got its start. So, you know, the ST had its advantage there. And it was swings and roundabouts what you wanted. I know people, when I was growing up certainly, who were adamant the ST was the better machine because look how close it got to the Amiga without all these custom chips. Which is true, there are some games where it's incredible how well the Atari ST version performs compared to the Amiga version, when it was a conversion that, like in the early days, had gone the opposite way and the game was being converted from the Amiga original to the Atari ST version. Without those chips, coders had to work harder, and sometimes they achieved miracles. Now, in terms of competing with the Amiga in that level as well, Atari did later on launch the STE line, which had some enhanced chips which brought it more in line with the A500. However, this really was a case of too little too late, and not a huge number of the STEs were sold, and even fewer games came out for the STE. Now, this is just purely from what I recall being around in the late 80s, early 90s, and really getting into computers and games at the time. I would see adverts for the Amiga and the ST in my Sinclair Spectrum magazines every month. And it was clear that even though the Amiga was often £100 more expensive than the equivalent Atari ST package, you were getting the better machine. The graphics looked better. We all knew from what we read it sounded better. When it comes down to it, ultimately, the war between the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga, well, Amiga won. Although, when you really look at it, given that both Atari and Commodore, as we knew them, both ceased to exist by the time the 16-bit home computer cycle had finished, it could be argued that neither of them won really, because they both just stopped. There was no follow-on really from either of them. Yes, they both tried with the Falcon and the A1200, but realistically, by the time we got to that point, the mid-1990s, Atari, Commodore, and then Amiga, and then ESCOM, they were dead. No one really won. It was a hollow victory for Commodore, really. They beat the Atari ST, they dominated the 16-bit home computer market, yet still went broke. Anyway, what do you think? Tell me what your memories are of the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga. Which machine do you think was the superior one? Was it the plucky underdog Atari ST, which was less powerful but cheaper? Or was it the more expensive custom hardware packed Amiga? Was that the machine that you felt dominated? Leave your comments down below. Tell me what you think. If you've enjoyed this video, please do hit that like button. If you really enjoyed it, you know, you can always hit the subscribe button as well. You can ring the bell to be notified when I upload a new video. You can take out a YouTube channel membership if you really enjoy what I do, or go over to my Patreon and join my Patreon. If you don't want to do that, but you still want to contribute, there's also a link below to my Ko-fi page. I do have to give a big shout out to Leftback and All Scott Retro for their continued month-to-month support of what I do here. It is much appreciated, much love to you guys. But anyway, I'm Rob. This is 8/16/32-bit. That was my take on the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga after 40 years. And I will see you on the next video. So long.